There's always weird laws that need to be revitalized, but apparently some politicians are too lazy to do the paperwork. So we should rethink why they're even in power in the first place if they're too lazy to fight for change. So let's look into it. Hi, my name is Jessa and we're going to look at the top 10 weird laws only women were forced to follow. Number 10. Coverture Laws. Coverture, also known as martial unity or femme covert, was a legal doctrine that existed in many Western societies until the 19th century, but also, in some way they're still kind of there. The concept of coverture significantly impacted the legal status and rights of women upon marriage. Once the central aspects of coverture was the merging of a woman's legal identity is that of hers and her husband's were as of one upon marriage. This meant that in the eyes of the law, a married woman and her husband became a single legal entity. Any property that she owned, including real estate and personal belongings, would become her husband's upon marriage. She could not enter into contracts or control her own finances independently, and in cases of divorce or separation, the legal custody of children were almost always granted to the husband, as the legal doctrine considered him to be the head of the household. The impact of coverture varied across different jurisdictions and evolved over time. While coverture was deeply ingrained in legal systems for centuries, it faced increasing criticism during the 19th century and eventually underwent reforms. The movement of women's rights, including the first wave of feminism, played a significant role in challenging and dismantling coverture laws. Number 9. Corset Regulations. During the late 19th and early 20th century, there were instances of corset regulations in some regions. Particularly in the United States, these regulations were attempts to address concerns about women's health and their public morality and the potential impact of corsets on the female body. Some US states and cities enacted laws that specifically specified the maximum length of corsets. These regulations were aimed at preventing the creation of extremely long corsets, which were considered not only a fashion concern but also a potential health risk. Enforcing corset regulations proved challenging as they required monitoring and measuring women's undergarments, which were both impractical and invasive. Compliance was difficult to ensure, and these regulations were not universally followed or reinforced, as over time, societal attitudes towards women's fashions and health evolved, and the popularity of corsets waned. Ultimately, the decline of corsets in women's fashions was driven by challenging aesthetics, fashion preferences, and evolving views on women's health. Number 8. Anti-flirtation laws. Anti-flirtation laws were laws or ordinances that at various points in history sought to regulate or prohibit what was considered inappropriate or aggressive flirting behavior in public spaces. These laws were often subjective and reflecting societal norms and values about modesty, decency, and public conduct. The term anti-flirtation laws is commonly associated with the early 20th century in the United States. During this period, some cities enacted laws or regulations aimed at curbing what authorities deemed as inappropriate or unwanted flirtatious behavior. In some cases, though, anti-flirtation laws were actually presented as a measure to protect women from unwelcome advances or harassment. The laws were framed as a way to ensure that a woman could move through public spaces without facing unwanted attention. Enforcing anti-flirtation laws posed challenges, as the laws were vague and determining what constituted inappropriate flirting was inherently subjective. The laws were sometimes criticized for being overly intrusive and arbitrary. Anti-flirtation laws faced criticism from various quarters. Civil liberties advocates argued that such laws encroached upon individuals' rights to free expression and personal interactions. As societal attitudes became more permissive, the enforcement of these laws ended up becoming increasingly unattainable. Number 7. Unequal inheritance laws. Historically, many societies had laws governing inheritance that were unequal and discriminatory, favoring male heirs over female heirs. These laws, rooted in patriarchal norms, often restricted women's rights to inherit property, land, or other assets. Practice like primogeniture is a system of inheritance in which the firstborn son inherits the entire estate of the parents, as this practice excludes daughters and younger sons from inheriting significant portions of the family's wealth. The Borough English system was also a variant of primogeniture in which the youngest son inherited the family estate, while the elder sons received other forms of compensation. Like primogeniture, it disadvantaged daughters in terms of inheritance. While dower rights provided some protections for widows by granting them a portion of their husband's estate, they were often limited compared to the inheritance rights of sons. Dower rights varied, and in some cases widows received only a life interest in a portion of the estate. Over time, reform movements and challenges and changes in societal attitudes led to legal reforms aimed at addressing gender-based inequalities in inheritance. These reforms sought to ensure the daughters had equal rights to inherit all the family property, or whatever is in the will. Number 6. Restrictions on working hours. Restriction on hours for women were common in various parts of the world, often based in societal norms, gender roles, and concerns about women's well-being. These restrictions were part of the labor laws or social norms that limited the hours when women could work, the type of jobs that they could engage in, and in some cases the conditions under which they could work. Laws and regulations in many places historically imposed restrictions on the number of hours women could work in a day or a week. These restrictions were often based on the assumption that women needed protection and rest during their roles as caregivers in the family. Certain professions and industries had explicitly exclusions for women, limiting their participation based on perceived physical or emotional limitations. For example, some jurisdictions restricted women from working in certain heavy industries or underground mining. Over time, however, changes in social attitudes and evolving perceptions of gender roles contributed to the relaxation of restrictions on working hours for women. As the women's rights movement gained momentum, there was an increase in recognition of women's rights to work without undue restrictions. Number 5. Foot binding in China. Foot binding was a traditional practice in China that involved tightly binding the feet of young girls to prevent normal growth and create small, delicate feet. This practice, which lasted for centuries, had profound cultural, social, and physical implications. The origins of foot binding are not entirely clear, but it is believed to have emerged during the Song dynasty and became widespread during the Ming and Qing dynasty. Foot binding was considered a symbol of beauty and social status. Small bound feet were associated with this feminine grace and delicacy, as it was seen as a mark of a woman's commitment to cultural norms and societal expectations. The bound foot had erotic connotations in Chinese culture, and the practice was linked to a concept of lotus feet. The process of foot binding was often fetishized, and the sight of a woman unbinding her feet was considered intimate. Ew. Social reformers, missionaries, and women's rights activists played a key role in campaigning against foot binding. The practice was finally officially banned in 1912 after the fall of the Qing dynasty, although it does still continue in some areas for a period. Number 4. Banning women on voting. Bans on women voting, also known as the women's suffrage restrictions, were historical practices that denied women the right to participate in political elections and vote. Such restrictions were widespread and persisted in various countries, such as much of history in the 19th and early 20th century saw the emergence of women's suffrage movements advocating for equal voting rights. Activists argue that women, like men, should have the right to participate in democratic processes. The Seneca Falls Convention in the United States in 1848 is often considered the starting point of the women's suffrage movement. At the convention, attendees, including prominent figures like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, discussed the need for women's rights, including the right to vote. The aftermath of World War I saw changes in the suffrage laws in various countries. In 1918, the United Kingdom passed the Representations of People's Act granting voting rights to certain women, and the US ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, enfranchising American women. Over time, women's suffrage became a global movement, and many countries progressively extended voting rights to women. The mid-20th century saw a shift towards universal suffrage, where voting rights were not restricted based on gender. Number 3. Limitation on jury services. Limitation on jury services historically for women were common in many jurisdictions, reflecting prevailing gender norms and societal expectations about women's roles. Such limitations often took the form of legal restrictions or cultural bases that excluded or restricted women's participation in jury duty. In some common law traditions, which include legal systems in countries like the United Kingdom and the United States, women were historically excluded or had limited participations in jury services. This exclusion was based on traditional views of women's roles as caregivers, and they perceived the lack of qualifications for legal decision-making or critical thinking. Women's rights advocates and suffragists challenged these exclusions, arguing that women were fully capable of serving as impartial jurors. In the 20th century, legal reforms aimed at dismantling gender-based barriers began to take effect. Legal challenges based on the principle of equal protection under the laws played a role in striking down gender-based exclusions. Courts began to recognize that excluding women from jury service solely based on their gender violated principles of equality and fairness. Despite legal reforms, challenges relating to gender-based biases in jury selections and other systematic issues persist. Efforts continue to address barriers to equal representation on jurors and to ensure diversity and fairness in the judicial system. Number 2. Modesty laws. Modesty laws, referred to as the regulations or dress codes that prescribed a certain standard of modesty in public attire. These laws are often influenced by cultural, religious, or societal norms that seek to regulate clothing choices in alliance with a perceived standard of decency. If you ever heard or seen in regards to dress codes, they are also in an alliance in some sort of modesty forums made in certain spaces. Various societies have implemented dress codes or modesty laws that dictate acceptable clothing in public spaces. These codes may specify the length of skirts and the coverage of shoulders or wearing the head's covering experience in some parts of Southeast Asia, if your hair is too long, your teachers actually somehow have the right to cut your hair short. In the US, if you do show your shoulders as a young girl, you could be asking for it. It's truly insane the limitations of these so-called dress codes of control of how one's dressed, no matter the context, is still apparent. Even in women's choices to wear the hijab, and laws in France as well in Quebec have limited or fully banned religious wear like the niqab or burqa when it comes to a woman who actually wants to wear it. Regardless what a person chooses to wear, just mind your damn business. And finally, number 1. Restrictions on education. Throughout history, women have faced various restrictions on education with limited access to formal learning opportunities. These restrictions were often rooted in societal norms, traditional gender roles, and discriminatory beliefs about women's intellectual capabilities. These restrictions were often rooted in societal norms, traditional gender roles, and discriminatory beliefs about women's intellectual capabilities. Women were frequently excluded from institutions of higher learning. Universities and colleges were historically male-dominated, and women faced significant barriers to enrollment. When they were admitted, their choices of study were often limited to certain suitable fields. For example, Ruth Bader Ginsburg had mentioned during her studies at Harvard it was a very rare few amount of women were allowed into these highly academic spaces, only to be challenged why were they there when a man should have been there instead. Restrictions on women's educations were not limited to any specific region or culture. Different societies impose on varying degrees of restrictions, and progress towards gender-inclusive education has occurred at different rates around the world. While progress has been made, challenges to women's education persist in some regions. Factors such as poverty, cultural norms, and gender-based violence can be impeded access to education for girls and women. As an example, Malala Yousafzai is one of who's personally experienced violence for advocating for education for women. But thankfully with her survival and recovery, her activism still persists in encouraging and inspiring women everywhere to strive for education. Education is really important, and to be honest, we all learn something new every day. So always be open to what you learn and you'd be surprised. That's all for this list, and as always, be sure to like and subscribe. My name is Jessa, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!